What's up, everybody? Welcome back to News Dose. And before we even get started, just as a bit of a preface, it is April Fool's Day. And, you know, this is always a strange day for really any kind of news. But you don't have to worry about that on this channel. We don't do that type of tomfoolery on this channel, so just kind of rest assured, because we will talk about legitimate news today. And that also includes my favorite generation of games, because they could be on their way back in a pretty interesting way. I mean, if you're like me and if you really like the PS360 generation, there is now a proposal on the table to bring back some of those games with enhancements and everything. So we will get all of that today and why this information is just so significant. Before we get started though, I do want to thank my supporters on Patreon and on YouTube memberships. You all are just absolutely awesome and I appreciate each and every single one of you. Let's just go and get right into things, though, starting off with Death Stranding for the second day in a row, because I want to make a correction for yesterday's video. I never want to steer you all wrong, and when I am wrong, I don't mind admitting that. Now, this is more of an oversight on my part, but even still, in case you missed yesterday's video, Death Stranding reached a new milestone for 20 million players, which is very, very impressive. Though I did note that that's not units sold, which that part is correct. It was a part of Game Pass a few years ago, which apparently I got some pushback for that in the comments. That is actually correct information. It was a part of PC Game Pass, I believe, back in 2022. And I remember that very well because it was major news at the time. You know, a Sony first-party game coming over to PC Game Pass. People were very, very excited about that. What I forgot about, though, is that Death Stranding was also a part of PlayStation Plus, and it was even available as a free game on the Epic Game Store at one point in time. So that 20 million number does become a little bit less impressive when you start to factor in all of these different things. It's difficult to say exactly how many units it sold, but even with all that said, it is still seemingly a very successful game, and the fact that 20 million people played the first game, I can also say that's a large pool of potential customers for its soon-to-be sequel. So, I mean, even if it didn't technically sell 20 million, a lot of those players could have possibly came from PlayStation Plus, the Epic Games Store, and PC Game Pass. That's still an overall net positive for Kojima because he probably made a lot of money off of those subscription deals. But on top of that, it also could potentially bring in a lot of new paying customers for the sequel. I mean, no matter how you slice it, the first game was seemingly a big-time success. That's the reason that it got a sequel in the first place. And now we just need to kind of see if they can translate that success over to the sequel, despite some of the polarizing responses that the first game had. Now, let's go talk about Nintendo news here real quick, and I'm trying to be real brief about this just because I'm refraining from talking about Switch 2 leaks and rumors because, I mean, you know, the Switch 2 Direct is tomorrow morning. I see zero reason at all to talk about leaks and rumors with that inbound. You know, just kind of let it be a surprise by this point and enjoy the showcase. But Nintendo did announce that they're going to hold 2 Treehouse events for later this week. You can see here where they said, join us on April 3rd and April 4th at 7 a.m. Pacific time each day for a Nintendo Treehouse Live Nintendo Switch 2 presentation featuring hands-on gameplay of Nintendo Switch 2 games. So, you know, the fun isn't simply going to end tomorrow. We will see some extra gameplay for Switch 2 games as the week progresses. So, hypothetically, if they reveal, let's just kind of say, a new 3D Mario tomorrow, but they don't really show a ton of gameplay, well, that's kind of where the Treehouse comes in. We could see even more gameplay of it there. So just kind of keep that in mind. But in the meantime, the Switch 2 Direct will officially be 60 minutes long. So this will be one of their longest showcases to date. Not only will we likely get more concrete details about the hardware, the price, pre-order details, and the release date, but there will likely be a long list of games to talk about come tomorrow. All right, so let's go and get into what I am personally very excited about today. And what I'll do here is that I'll first dive into what's happening, and then I'm going to get into why this is just so significant in the first place. So this comes from a VGC interview where Night Dive Studios said they want to start remastering Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 games. Now, if you're unaware of who Night Dive Studios is, they're the studio behind HD remasters like the Turok trilogy, several Quake games, System Shock, and even Shadow Man. So most of their work includes older retro titles, but the idea that they could start doing PS360 games, that opens up the door for a lot of exclusives that are still lost on those consoles, and with even better performance. I mean, if you go back and play a lot of those games, the performance often, leaves something to be desired. So this could be a way to bring back some of those games with things like 60 FPS and 4K visuals. So I think that alone is potentially exciting to think about. But the most exciting part for me personally is the idea that they could bring back exclusive games that we haven't seen in over a decade. In fact, in this very interview, they mentioned PlayStation 3 games. I mean, the PS3 has always been infamous for its cell processor. It's not exactly the easiest console to develop for. And Night Dive Studios even said that could potentially pose a challenge for them. But they're also confident that they could pull a remaster off given their experience when it comes to remasters. So that suddenly opens up the door for a number of PS3 exclusives for modern consoles. And the timing of this interview is what makes this situation even more interesting. I mean, think about it this way. If we go back just 1 week ago, what did we learn from Sony specifically? If you remember right, at the Nintendo Direct, they revealed Patapon and Everybody's Golf will both get HD remasters developed by Bandai Namco. So they are licensing out their games to third-party publishers. So what's to say that they would refuse Night Dive Studios, one of the most renowned HD developers? What's to say that they wouldn't get a similar treatment? I mean, they have a great track record, and if they wanted to remaster, let's say, the Killzone trilogy, the Resistance trilogy, the Little Big Planet games, or even the PS3 Ratchet and Clank games, I mean, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that Sony would be open to that idea. In fact, in a recent poll on Push Square, it was revealed that over 70% of PlayStation 5 fans want Sony to license out their dead franchises for HD remasters. So, I mean, unless they have their own internal plans for PS3 emulation around the corner, which I don't expect, then I see no reason not to hire a studio like Night Dive to remaster some of their older PS3 exclusives. I mean, truthfully, that's easy money for Sony, and as we saw last week, they could even include a release for PC and Nintendo, which would bring them in even more money. I mean, it's not like they're doing much else with these games for the time being. They're not making a lot of money on them right now, so they might very much like this idea. Now, meanwhile, Xbox, they have put a lot of work into their backwards compatibility. So we already have a lot of the Xbox 360 games available on things like the Xbox Series, but notably, Bethesda has worked with Night Dive in the past on games like Doom and Quake. So they do have a history working together, and, if Xbox wanted some 60 FPS and 4K enhancements for some of their Xbox 360 games, that could be worth it for them. And then, of course, there's a lot of third-party games that could also use some enhancements as well. So let me know what you all think about this. If they were to bring back any of these games, what Xbox 360 and PS3 titles would you most like to see return first with an HD remaster? Now, one last thing before we go, the former PlayStation Shu Yoshida is back in the news once again for airing out more information about his previous employer and what actually happened behind the scenes. Now, this is not new for Shu. He seemingly left Sony on bad terms as they pushed him out. So now he just seems to be voicing everything by this point, and this might not be a major surprise per se, but still frustrating nonetheless. So what's happening here is that a few years ago, you might remember that Sony shut down their longtime Sony Japan studio, the same exact studio that worked on the Ape Escape series, the Eco Trilogy, Bloodborne, Gravity Rush, Puppeteer, and the list goes on and on and on. They were one of their most beloved studios specifically for their creativity. So when they shut down, a lot of fans were very upset about that. Well, according to Shu, the reason that Sony shut them down in the first place is because their games were deemed AA. And at the time, Sony didn't want those type of games anymore. He said at the time, the Japan studio was a team that was good at making AA. In that case, it probably doesn't match what the company and first party are looking for. And that truthfully is such a shame. If you need more evidence that today's Sony is not the Sony that we grew up with, this here is the perfect example of that. Ever since the rise of Jim Ryan and Herman Holst, they've gone nuclear on this idea that everything, just absolutely everything, needs to be a big AAA blockbuster or a live service game. That's exactly why last year's Astrobot was such a refreshing change of pace for them. Here came a Sony game that didn't need, 6+ years of development with a $300 million budget. Instead, it was all about the gameplay. It didn't need, 7 hours of cutscenes and, a bunch of microtransactions to sell it. It was just simple fun. And I think we need more of those type of games, especially with the climate that we're currently in. I mean, the fact that Astrobot had a smaller budget, that also means that it doesn't have to go on to sell 10+ million copies. It's not going to sink a studio if it doesn't sell that many copies. And that's something that Shu mentioned. He talked about just how crazy budgets have gotten. And he even said that Sony needs to rethink their focus on cutting-edge graphics. The budgets are just too overbloated by this point. And if you have to sell 5+ million copies for razor-thin profits, then there might be something wrong with your business strategy. I mean, I remember a time when if a AAA game sold 1 to 2 million units, that was a celebration. But somehow, somewhere along the way, we've kind of gotten to this point that these games need to sell 5 times that amount. And I don't think that games have gotten necessarily 5 times as better over the past 20 years. A lot of these companies have kind of forgotten what a game is supposed to be in the first place. And that's fun. I mean, no matter how much you focus on the most minute details, gamers will continue to judge your product on 3 different things. Is it fun? Does it have a good story? And are the characters likable? Now, you don't have to have all 3 of those games for every single game, but the thing is that you can do all 3 of these things without spending $300 million. I'm just saying, because it is unsustainable. And Shu Yoshida is just the latest prominent figure within the game industry to point that out. Even the former PlayStation boss, Sean Layden, has said something similar. And this is all the more reason that I feel like PlayStation has kind of lost their way under their leadership this past generation. Now, hopefully that will improve under their new leadership. Hopefully they can get back on track. But this is still frustrating nonetheless, because if both Sean and Shu, if they were to have stayed at Sony, and if Sony would have had listened to them in the first place, I feel like we as customers would have gotten more games and also more creative games this generation than what we've gotten thus far. And who knows, maybe Sony Japan would also still be around. So it's just a shame how everything is kind of played out. But I mean, we'll kind of see what's next for Sony. We'll see what happens here in the next 5 to 7 years as this new leadership, takes control, and see how they implement their new strategies on the PlayStation business. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this episode. But until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and peace out.